Hi everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Keeping Up with Browser Privacy Changes. I'm Ruby Brown and I'll be your host today. So real quick before we get started, I want to mention that the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available on our website and our YouTube channel once it's finished. In addition, if you have any questions come up, please feel free to type them into your question panel at any time during the presentation, and we'll have some dedicated Q&A time at the end of the webinar. So that's all the business to take care of. Now I'd like to introduce our presenter, Cory Underwood. Cory is currently a platform engineer at Search Discovery and a longtime programmer and analyst. So welcome, Cory.
Thank you, Ruby, for having me. And I'd like to say thank you for SiteSpect for hosting this, and thank you all for attending. So today's talk is keeping up with browser privacy, specifically looking at the impact that those may have had on A/B testing. And with that in mind, we're going to go over quickly who I am, a little bit of the state of the industry, what some of the more recent browser impacts to your optimization program might be. I have a interesting example of device reporting. I'd like to talk a little bit about some things that you could look at for mitigating or solving some of these issues. I'd like to talk a little bit about the things that I think might be coming out down the road. And then finally, I have a list of links for people to reference if they want to dive deeper into some of what I've been talking about at a future point. So starting off with that, as Ruby said, I am a platform engineer for Search Discovery. I've been a developer for the past 8 years in the analytics space, 10 years overall in web development. I've held roles as a tech lead for analytics, A/B testing, personalization, and privacy. And I have a blog where I talk fairly extensively about the different browser privacy and legal privacy regulations and what impact that would have for analytics and A/B testing. Search Discovery, if you've never heard of it, is a data transformation company based out of Georgia. And we help businesses use data with purpose to drive meaningful impact. So that's what we do. We do everything from data strategy to implementation and analysis. But what's the most important message today? It would be not keeping up with browser privacy changes risks loss of data, inaccurate data, and misallocation of funds. So depending on what is changing in the ecosystem, you might no longer be able to get the same data that you had. Or maybe you get data, but maybe it doesn't actually represent what's going on. But also, if you're making decisions, you're going to spend some money to invest in development or what have you. If your underlying data is flawed, there's a chance that you're going to make the wrong choice. And if you're not keeping up with all of that, you wouldn't necessarily know what you don't know, and that has a greater possibility of impacting you. So with that in mind, let's look at a couple of the browser changes. But first, let's look at state of the industry. So here's a timeline of September through March. Browsers are consistently changing. That pace has increased over time, as in the old days, browsers used to not get upgraded unless you upgraded your operating system. Most people would just leave it as whatever the default was. Nowadays, browsers auto upgrade every 6 to 8 weeks for Chrome and Firefox. Edge is a little bit slower than that, but Safari still has several major releases a year. And now that takes it away from the user. The user doesn't actually have to manually choose to upgrade. It's probably going to happen. And so the stuff is getting rolled out to a larger proportion faster than it has been. But if we look just at the last several months, in September, Safari 13 was released. In November, Brave as a browser was launched. And you might not know what Brave is, but they claim to have 12 million monthly active users, 3 million daily active users, and Brave is a browser that puts privacy first and actively breaks analytic systems in effort to keep the people that use the browser from being tracked. Then in December, Safari updated their intelligent tracking prevention, which is the series of protocols that impacts cross-site tracking, which as collateral damage impacts analytics and A/B testing. In December, they also confirmed a user agent change for Safari, which we'll talk about in a little bit. In January, California Consumer Protection Act went into effect, and that changed the governance framework for residents of California. So now you need to know what data you're collecting on them, and you need to be able to report it out to them, and so on. Then in January, Edge changed their entire browser engine, and they went from Edge HTML to a Chromium-based change. So Edge under the hood is really Chrome minus some of the things that Google specifically wants. If you're using Google Analytics, Google said that they can no longer provide service provider and network domain dimensions. So if you had any filters on that kind of stuff, those probably aren't working as you might expect. In February, just prior to the pandemic, Chrome started rolling out their same site cookie change. So if you're sharing data cross-site, you had to make updates or that stopped working. Now, since the pandemic hit, they've rolled that back, but they plan on re-implementing that in June. So your stuff may have started to break, but then it resumed working as normal. So it would look as an anomaly, but it's going to be a priority for people going forward that need to communicate cross-domain. And then in March, Safari again updated the intelligent tracking prevention protocols. So we're just moving right along. The pandemic slowed things down slightly, but we're still picking up speed. And this stuff is consistent. Usually every month, there's some major change to a different browser. But the browsers don't agree. So they're going in slightly different directions. So let's look at some of the impacts. The code won't always run as you expect. You can set a cookie, which is a piece of text on the browser, to store information and stitch together a session. Cookies are essential for like e-commerce and banking. But depending on how you set the cookie, either being JavaScript or on the server, you might have far shorter durations than you might intend. And as an example of this, a server-side testing solution, for example, might segment somebody for 6 months. And so once they're in a cell, they're not going to shift unless they delete the cookie. But if you're in Safari and you happen to hit its intelligent tracking prevention and it sets the cookie via client-side JavaScript, it might be set for 24 hours under some scenarios. It might be set for 7 days. It might be set for some other period of time based off the browser behavior in between when it gets set and the time the clock runs out. And so from a testing perspective, this is problematic because you want your code to work consistently because a test is an experiment. And so it has rigor to it, and you don't want people jumping cells any more than they need to. And all the math is based on that. But unless you're actually controlling for this, this is likely impacting you. So tools such as Target and Optimizely and VWO have all come out with different guidance on how to fix this so their cookie and state setup gets stored correctly. But those are changes that you have to take above and beyond just adding the code to the site. Then you have server-side tools like Conductrix, SiteSpect, etc., who aren't impacted by this because of how they're designed. So depending on what vendor you have, you might actually have additional steps to take in order to get this to run. But it's not just the state that's impacted. We'll talk a little bit more about this as we go through, but a good example of this would be the domain that is in the referrer. So if you ever do like a referral analysis, you want to see where your visitors have come from. It used to be you get the domain path, so www.example.com/path/index.html, and you could say, hey, that specific page on that website is what drove the business. Well, over the last several months, browsers have started to put in controls. So when it is cross-site, so they come from somewhere else that is not your website to your website, you get www.example.com, you don't know the pathing. And if your test is built on looking at that, that's probably not going to work as you would expect, because the underlying conditions of how the internet works are changing. So we talked a little bit about how they set cookies to different durations, but that's not all. Safari, Brave, and a couple of other browsers will look at and control access to the storage mechanics of the browser. And they will systematically purge those at specific points. So what originally happened was Safari released ITP 2.0, 2.1 back in 2019, and the browsers are like, okay, well, if we can't leverage first-party client-side cookies, oh, let's go to local storage. And then Safari is like, well, no. So now Safari also deletes local storage in addition to the cookies. And it's just an arms race. But the net result is the client and anything that you do on it is now a very unstable place. And if your system is looking at that for segmentation, if it's looking at that for data storage because you know they wanted to do consent management on the client, and so they come in and they go through the consent thing and they set all their cookies, and then the consent manager sets that as a cookie on the client, that's probably going to be deleted every 24 hours to 7 days under Safari users. So it's a much more annoying user experience, but now your developers need to actually think about these scenarios where before that was a perfectly valid infrastructure design and it didn't make sense to do things overly complex if you didn't have to. Now you have to go through that complexity because the simple way no longer works. Then we have a whole different class of issues where certain browsers deny access to cookies and storage on the client. So Edge, for example, has something that they call a site engagement score. And depending on what your browser is doing and what it is talking to, it may not tell the remote system any of the information because the browser's like, we don't know that they want you to have it. Meanwhile, Safari will just outright block third-party cookies. Firefox will conditionally block things from loading or getting access to storage. And as a result, the way this works is different on each browser, but that means that your infrastructure now needs to account for a number of different scenarios. And depending on how impacted your specific setup is, you could end up having to redesign or refactor a fairly large amount of your site just to keep it working like it did prior to all of these changes starting to be implemented. But let's look at device reporting, because this is a simple way of seeing just how a small change can have dramatic impact. So browsers can lie. It's a client-side thing. You don't necessarily know who the browser is. You don't know if they're telling the truth. But if you look at just this chart, you'll see that Safari traffic in the US in September was 73% of tablet traffic. And by February, it was down to 58%. And while we did see a raise on Chrome, you'd be hard pressed to say all of that Safari traffic went to Chrome. But what happened? Well, in December, Safari finally released an article, but going back to September, they changed the user agent for Safari. So in most scenarios, Safari will actually identify as a Mac OS desktop, which means any logic you had of targeting Safari as a tablet probably isn't working because the user agent has changed, and the user agent was the traditional method of identifying what an iPad was. But then we take that further. The analytics, Adobe and Google, etc., also look at the user agent to decide, hey, is this a tablet And if the tablet itself is saying, no, I'm a desktop, the system has to take that at face value. It's not doing additional checks. It doesn't know. So if you're looking at this, you're like, oh, maybe my website is suffering some sort of issue on tablet traffic for iPads. That's probably not the case. But if you're not watching like the operating system beta notes and watching the whole process go through, where this was reported as a bug several times before Safari was finally like, no, that's how we want it, you could spend a huge amount of time trying to debug your website or your test without ever checking that the underlying assumption that the user agent is different was still true. And all that was a string change, but that impacts any trending reports for device analysis, that impacts your browser breakdowns if you also sort by platform, and that would impact targeting rules for a testing platform if you're trying to target tablets specifically. So some scary stuff, but that's just an example of one of the changes and the impact that that could have. So let's look at a couple possible solutions, because there has to be something we can do. Well, there is. So a lot of the browsers are targeting third-party data and trying to break third-party tracking. Now, the unfortunate effect here is in the crusade to do that, it can unintentionally break legitimate use cases for how things work. So you want to do as much data collection in first party as possible. You want to limit your need to make third-party calls if you can, because you don't want the call to be blocked. You do want to be able to access the data, but it's a different technical design. And depending on how your infrastructure is configured, that may be more or less viable. But then let's say it's not viable given the current infrastructure. Do you make the investment to have to go forward and change off how it all works? Well, maybe. It's hard to say without knowing your specific browser mix, but this is the way things are going. So what I would say is things are probably going to get worse. And I would strongly recommend moving to first party at the earliest opportunity, if nothing else. But like I have mentioned, different vendors have issued guidance for how their products should be modified to work. And it's worth reviewing your existing setup with them. Like I said, Target has different things that it can do. Optimizely wants you to install like a hybrid endpoint to set the state, and same with VWO. Optimize doesn't really have a solution there. I mean, they allow you to run optimized server side, but that has a number of downstream impacts to development and test execution. And it may be that when you're working with these vendors, you find that your existing setup doesn't work, or their product hasn't adapted to the changing ecosystem as a whole. And then you have to question, well, is this still the right product for my program? So some pretty heavy discussions, a lot of analysis, but I would strongly recommend validating your setup at earliest opportunity. Developers are going to have to handle state differently. It used to be that it was very simple. You know, they put JavaScript on the page and it would do all the things, and there wasn't a site deployment, and you could even run stuff through the tag manager if you really had to. All of that's probably not going to work going forward in the same way that it used to in the past. Because now how you do something is nearly as important as what it does, if not more so. So using JavaScript to do everything is going to run into some hard limitations because of the way that browsers are coming down on JavaScript as an unintentional form of tracking. So different tools are being put into place. CNAME redirects, which make the remote call look like it's coming from your domain. Some people have built reverse proxy servers, so you call a server in your domain and then have that server call out. Or instead of using JavaScript on the front end to make the call. They have the server. Do they do like a server to server connection and handle that way? And all of those are substantially different than the old style of doing just straight up JavaScript to handle everything. But with the current way that the browsers are going, the development team now has to take a much more comprehensive look at how they want to do certain things. And that could mean building out infrastructure where before it was just simply adding some more JavaScript to the page. 2019 was a super busy year in the analytics space as far as like legal compliance and different browser changes that had gone through. And I think 2020 is going to eclipse it. The pandemic did slow things down, but we're starting to pick speed up again. And the major thing here is, unless you're actually keeping up with all this stuff, it's probably going to hit you, and it's problematic to do the analysis after the fact. So you want to be proactive about it. So I would consider putting in processes that validate your data quality on a regular basis, but you'd also need to be prepared for a continued investment in this space to retain accuracy. So you're going to continue to spend money. You're not going to necessarily get more data, but you might be able to keep the data that you're already collecting as opposed to lose it entirely. And that's a different mindset. And it's one that can prompt some difficult conversations. It's like, why am I still spending money just to keep the system working as it did versus why can't I build new features? And it's because the underlying internet is fundamentally changing. So anything designed under the old assumptions, it might not work under the new reality of how things need to work. And that's an unfortunate thing, but the right decisions 5 years ago may not be the right decisions in 2020. And so it's working through that whole process and seeing, okay, if this continues going forward, where do we think it's going to go? What should our infrastructure and our design and what platform should we use going forward to mitigate or reduce the likelihood that that's going to adversely impact us? So some things I'm currently tracking. These may come to pass, they may not. It's stuff that's being discussed, but it kind of shows you where we're leaning. So Google and Safari have both issued proposals on how they're going to change ad attribution going forward. So in the current internet, ad attribution is typically done through a link that comes in with a set of name value pairs, such as the UTM parameters for Google Analytics. And then there's a corresponding purchase event that occurs on thank you. And it says specifically, this user did this thing, and we know it. How they're proposing this is, instead of the purchase event sending that information to, say, Google Ads directly, the browser will hold on to it for a bit, randomly for up to 48 hours before communicating that to the ad system. And so that makes it a lot more fuzzy, because what if the browser's not online in 48 hours? Well, it would potentially make it at the next earliest opportunity, but that's no guarantee. There's no guarantee on when the next earliest opportunity would even be. Google and Safari have kind of united on that aspect of it. They have diverged a bit on how much data they want to be able to communicate back to the systems, but we're likely to see, if this goes forward, some sizable change in how ad attribution is measured. And so if you're trying to figure out A/B testing ad creative, for example, or you're trying to figure out the effect on the website based off interactions with ads, it's going to be harder to do going forward, should this go through. Safari is pushing a is-logged-in API. And I don't necessarily know there's a lot of appetite for this in the larger ecosystem, but what they want to do is delete all client-side storage when the user isn't logged in. So if the user is not logged in, all their state gets deleted, which would ultimately impact things like guest shopping carts, but it would also mean that if they're not logged in, in a testing perspective, then they potentially get resegmented the next time they get logged in. So that's scary because it breaks a lot of things. We don't know if that's going to go through. But if they do push this in and they do make that required in the same way that they made the user access API required for dealing with third-party cookies, that would be very problematic. It would break a lot of things, but they've done that in the past, so I can't rule it out entirely. But it's something to pay attention to if this goes through. The one thing that is consistent and we are going to see is a continued loss of data. So data may become off limits. We saw this previously when Google stopped showing keywords for search results. We're seeing this more recently that you can't get the path for refer information. Brave in their current nightly build is now randomizing and adding severe bits of randomization to multiple fingerprinting avenues. So that's something that they want to prohibit. Like right now it's cookies, maybe local storage. They don't want people to like migrate to different methods of tracking. So the browsers are putting in and locking down different things that could be used as a tracking alternative to cookies. Coincidentally, also with that in mind, there's a privacy group in the World Wide Web Consortium that is looking at this type of stuff. How do we do ad measurement if we also don't want tracking to occur all the time? And how do we do different things? And that's some really good discussion, but we're likely looking at and seeing new tech coming online, which would drive sites to need to adapt to it because the existing methods may just stop working. And it's important to realize, like, if we lost access to X or Y piece of data, what that might mean for you. So we'll have to see where that goes. But it is scary, I will admit. So I have some resources that I think they will give out this deck, and I will make it available for them. But you can see there's some Twitter accounts that you might want to follow. There's some blogs to read. There's all the different browser news blogs that you can follow along with. And there's some tools. So cookiestatus.com is ran by Simo Ahava, and it's a list of all of the current protections in place by some of the top browsers. But then you need your developers to like look at those and figure out, well, what of this actually impacts our website. The browser dev console, if your developers are looking at that, can be super helpful because now as browsers do some of this stuff, they put in warnings. And in some cases, they warn people for 6, 8, 12 months ahead of time before the change comes in. So if it's impacting your site, people just need to be looking at the notice because they try to give as much heads up as possible. Safari is a little bit different in that regard, in that their changes are commonly announced after they've gone in, which is problematic from a keeping your site working point of view. But we have to work with what we got. The platform documentation is very good in some tools, and we'll go over how all of this works for that tool. And the best thing I can say is you have to follow it. And if you don't, you need to know what the impact to your platform would be. And I do think that, and I would strongly recommend going forward, that the tech team and the marketing team or the optimization team periodically review like what's going on in this space, because every 3 to 4 months, it could be a whole new scenario that now you have to suddenly account for in your test design or your website design. And with that, that is my presentation, and I am welcome and I'm hoping rather to answer any questions that you may have. I will provide this deck to SiteSpect to distribute. And with that, I'm turning it back over to Ruby.
Thank you so much, Cory, and thank you everyone for joining us today. It was a great presentation, and we have some time now to move into a Q&A discussion. So if you have any questions, again, go ahead and type them into that Q&A panel in your Zoom. And then again, just as a reminder, the full presentation it is recorded and will be available on our website and on YouTube. So in addition to making the slides available, you can revisit the presentation at any time. All right, so let's jump into some questions here. All right, so if I'm looking back at my data over the past year or so, and I realize that that data is inaccurate or misleading, what is best practice for correcting course at that point?
So you want to work with your tech team and isolate what parts of the data you feel are inaccurate, and then they would have to investigate based off your reporting product, whatever that may be, what they can do to mitigate or correct that. And they might come back with, we can't fix that. Or they might come back with, we can fix that, but it's going to be very expensive. And then it would be up to you to make the business case to justify the expenditure of effort for them to do that work. And it could be very time consuming to do that analysis. But if you feel that is critical to some of your KPIs or your reports that are seen by executives, it might be worth doing.
Awesome. All right, next question. Are these changes changing the user experience at all?
They are. So if something was primarily JavaScript designed, then, and it was setting all of those cookies or state, what I would expect to happen is things like consent boxes or pop-up windows, things that maybe you only intended to see every 30 days, survey tools, for example, those might show up much more often, particularly if a lot of your traffic comes in on, like every third day, but they come in through paid ads, because when that happens, Safari will set the browser to 24 hours. So a Firefox user could see the pop-up window every 30 days. A Safari user might see it every time they come back. So it's problematic from a QA perspective, and it's problematic from a user experience perspective. And that's why your developers need to be aware of it and design around that, because you can actually design things differently so you have a consistent experience across user browser combinations.
Thank you. Next question here is, where do you see the A/B testing industry going in the future, and what does that mean for client-side tools such as Target, Optimizely, VWO, which you mentioned, who have already created a workaround which may not work in the future?
It's hard to say. I do think that I foresee a rise in server-side platforms. Conductrix and SiteSpect come to mind. There's a couple of other ones that I don't know their current architecture recommendations, but as a general rule of thumb, I think A/B testing and tagging is likely to move off of the client. That's good for performance reasons. For testing, it would also eliminate Flickr, but it is more of a lift developer-wise to get that into place and have that work. I do think that that's going to end up having to be what it is, because the best way to not fight with the browser is to not rely on it to do anything. And assuming that you comply with the legal landscape, I think that would be the best long-term approach.
Cool, thank you. I think that's all the questions we have for right now. Again, if anybody thinks of questions later, oh, we got another one come in. We can get to this one too. So there's a lot of buzz around AI optimization and personalization tools. Are these impacted too, and how? And what about product recs?
So if your recommendation engine is It depends on how the recommendation engine is built. So if it's a third-party recommendation engine, it is likely more impacted than if it was first-party. And it just comes down to a recommendation engine is effective because it knows who you are. Maybe not you specifically, but it knows that this browser consistently comes to the site and looks at these things. And so the recommendation engine is like, this thing that I know looked at these things last time, I'm going to show it new things now until it refines its model. But if the way the recommendation engine works is setting data in a way that the browser is going to systematically remove it, then you end up constantly re-entering what is known in recommendations as like a cold start scenario. So every time you come back, it's like, hey, I've never seen you before. Here's a random assortment. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Yep.
Yes. So again, if you think of questions later, please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Cory's email is up on the screen. You've got cory.underwood@searchdiscovery.com. And you can always reach out to us at SiteSpect at info@sitespect.com. And we'll connect you to who you need to talk to get the answer to your question. Thank you, Cory, so much for joining us and for this awesome presentation. And thank you, everybody, for attending.
And I want to say thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you, SiteSpect, for having me.